Well, the US Secretary of State is calling on all nations to take new measures against North Korea. Specifically, he said China and Russia must indicate their intolerance for these reckless launches by taking direct actions of their own. Well, we have our correspondent Craig Leeson in Tokyo with a reaction from Japan. But first, let's cross live to Andrew Thomas. He's in the South Korean capital, Seoul. Andrew, the South Koreans had been expecting this launch, I suppose. How have they been responding so far?
Well, they certainly were expecting it, and North Korea had made no secret after the UN resolution was passed on Monday imposing tougher sanctions on them that they would continue with their nuclear missile test, the missile test and the nuclear test. And this is the first example, very swiftly, of that, another missile test. It took off just over 6 hours ago now, at 6:57 in the morning, local time, Korean time. It was in the air exactly 6 hours ago. It flew for 19 minutes before coming down in the sea to the east of Japan. Now, South Korea's National Security Council met within an hour of that missile taking off. They met for a couple of hours and they've put out a statement within the last hour. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. The first part, to be expected, that they condemn North Korea's provocative actions despite the UN Security Council's unanimous decision on Resolution 2375 and warnings from the international community. These provocations, they say, will only aggravate North Korea's isolation diplomatically and economically. But the statement goes further, and this I want to bring everyone's attention to because it's significant. Regarding the test, they say, President Moon was briefed by the National Security Advisor before and after the launch and gave his order of counterfire with a Hyunmoo missile. Now, that refers to a missile launch that South Korea carried out within 4 minutes of North Korea launching its missile. That missile from South Korea flew for 250 kilometres, which is the same distance it would have needed to fly between where it was launched from and where the North Korean missile took off from. It was not fired towards that site. It was not fired towards North Korea, because the South Koreans knew that this was a missile test by the North, not a launch they believed in anger at either them or one of their allies. But they are demonstrating there that they have the capacity, they were watching the site, they have the capacity to fire at a site, a launch site, immediately that they notice that a missile has been launched, or even preventatively, immediately preempting a strike. So that's significant as well. They're watching and ready to respond. Now, President Moon, obviously, he chaired that meeting at the National Security Council, and this is what he had to say immediately after.
In this situation, having a dialogue with North Korea is impossible. North Korea will face even stronger sanctions and pressures from the international community. That will force them to come to the path of dialogue. We should be equipped to protect ourselves from North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threats, and to eliminate those threats by quickly punishing them in case of provocations against us.
Andrew, in terms of going forward then, so what sort of military response policy are we likely to see from the South Koreans?
Well, Darren, the South Koreans have always had a three-pronged approach. They want the capacity to be able to take out a missile site before a missile is launched, and that's partly what that test was all about earlier on Friday. That's number one. Number two is they want the capacity to take out a missile in flight. That is partly what the THAAD anti-missile device is all about. And third, they want North Korea to know that they are ready to launch missiles of their own in a punishment capacity in retaliation for any strike. A three-pronged approach. That is the approach they've always said they are going to do. The missile launch the South Koreans carried out early Friday as soon as they noticed that the North Koreans had launched a missile. That taps into, if you like, points 1 and 3. It's both a demonstration that they can preemptively take out a launch site, but also that they have the capacity to punish afterwards. But they're also working with the United States about potentially bringing in more THAAD batteries into this country as a way of intercepting a missile in flight. So all of these issues will have been discussed at the National Security Council meeting as well in Seoul, and of course they'll be talked about with the Americans too.
All right, Andrew Thomas there in Seoul. Andrew, thank you. Let's cross over now to Tokyo and talk to Craig Leeson, who's there for us. Craig, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe condemning this latest launch in the strongest possible terms. What else has he been saying?
Well, that's right. He arrived back from an economic summit in India and straight away spoke to media and called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. He also called on the UN Security Council to immediately implement those tougher sanctions which we saw them ratify on Tuesday. Those were pushed through by the United States with Japan's support and China and Russia's support at the time. He's also called on the international community to unite as one and condemn the North Koreans and also try and force them to stop what he calls these provocations. Now, that is something that we're likely to see happen given the kind of reaction we've seen from the United States and certainly from South Korea and Japan this morning. There was very little danger, however, to civilians in the north of the country. This missile flew across and landed in the Pacific, but there was a public alert and people were alerted on their mobile phones. There was radio and television announcements. The main concern for the Japanese government was that something might fall from the missile. This was to be expected to some degree, given the strong rhetoric we heard from North Korea yesterday threatening to sink Japan with a nuclear weapon. So Japan, I think, expected this kind of retaliation because of the support that Japan provided to the United States with those strengthened sanctions that were pushed through in the UN Security Council on Tuesday. Darren?
All right, Craig Leeson there in Tokyo. Craig, thank you. Mike Hanna has more now from Washington, D.C.
Well, we understand that President Trump has been fully briefed on the North Korean situation by his Chief of Staff, John Kelly. There's also been comment from the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, making very clear that Russia and China in particular have a responsibility to bring more pressure to bear on North Korea. He says that China provides North Korea with much of its oil and that Russia employs a large amount of North Korean laborers, making very clear that he expects Russia and China to take some form of unilateral action in order to ratchet up pressure on North Korea. But the problem is there's still no real clarity as to exactly what the US policy is on North Korea. There have been different views coming from different parts of the Trump administration. President Trump himself appears willing to let China take the lead, to allow China to bring pressure to bear on North Korea. But as the latest missile launch shows, this policy not really working out. So still no clear unified policy from the US administration on how to deal with this ongoing North Korean crisis.
And our diplomatic editor, James Bays, has more now from the United Nations.
This will be seen as an act of defiance by the UN Security Council, and already they've called a closed session on Friday to discuss the situation, and particularly the very provocative timing, because this missile launch came just 72 hours after the last Security Council meeting in which they imposed further sanctions on North Korea, and it comes just days before world leaders meet here in New York for the high-level session of the UN General Assembly. President Trump, for example, will be speaking here on Tuesday. It means that there is a high-level North Korean delegation coming to New York, including the North Korean foreign minister, who'll be speaking to the General Assembly next Friday. Now, I don't think he's likely to have meetings with the US or any of its Western partners, or with Japan or South Korea. But in the past, the North Korean foreign minister has met with the UN Secretary General, so it's possible there could be a very important meeting with the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
All right, let's talk to YoungSik Bond. He's a research fellow at the Institute for North Korean Studies at Yonsei University. He joins us live now from Seoul. Mr. Young, I suppose we were all expecting this latest missile launch by North Korea, but what is the message here from Pyongyang, and what exactly is their end game, do you think?
The core message is twofold. One is it's a protest in defiance of the UN Security Council Resolution 2375, just passed in the aftermath of North Korea's 6th nuclear test. And the other message, which is more important, is that North Korea will never relent. It will continue to test and develop intercontinental ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons until they reach the capability to hit nuclear missiles anywhere in the world, including the United States.
It's a worrying point you make to say that they won't relent. So is North Korea open then to any kind of dialogue or engagement, or is that door firmly shut until, as you say, they've perfected their nuclear program?
The door is open, but North Korea wants to first complete its nuclear and ICBM capability. Then they will enter into diplomatic negotiations with the premise that North Korea will only agree on any deal that will possibly freeze North Korea's nuclear weapons and ICBMs, but never eliminating them, because North Korea wants to keep those weapons as the most reliable means for its survival. Then it does not cost North Korea anything to negotiate with the United States, because it will keep what it already has.
And even if North Korea completes its nuclear program, but I mean, that still doesn't guarantee them security and survival, does it?
Well, but from the North Korean standpoint, it gives North Korea a higher probability for survival, right? I mean, look at Libya's Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein's Iraq. According to North Korea's own testimony, then their demises are due to the fact that they stopped developing nuclear weapons.
Let me get a final thought from you, Mr. Young. What about the US and China and, to a lesser extent, Russia? What can they do going forward to stop nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula?
I think they will first focus on persuading North Korea on freezing its nuclear and missile programs. The denuclearization is such a lofty long-term goal. So freezing will be their immediate goal, and they will, agree on imposing another, probably harsher, UN Security Council resolution on North Korea. That explains why it took only 8 days for UN Security Council to pass the, resolution 2375, because they anticipated that North Korea would continue to test long-range missiles and nuclear warheads.
YoungSik Bond, thank you very much indeed, sir, for your time. Well, Robert Kelly from South Korea's Pusan National University believes this launch will trigger South Korea and Japan to further boost their civil defense systems.
Regular South Koreans, sort of like my friends, my family, my students, really have no idea what to do at all, and I think you're probably going to start to get that. You may recall that the government of Guam handed out flyers about what to do if there was a nuclear blast near Guam. I think that's coming here. Japan has already started with civil defense and putting people in shelters. I also think missile defense is the future. If the North Koreans are going to build missiles, then I think Japan and South Korea are going to build missile defense, and you'll see something of a measure for countermeasure, kind of arms race. But missile defense is expensive. It doesn't really work very well. So if the North Koreans don't stop building missiles, missile defense ultimately won't be enough, and then there will be pressure for air.